Hello, and welcome to Wavicle, the podcast that reflects on the process of being part of Social Action Inquiry Scotland. We delve into what has emerged for us during this process of being part of the inquiry. We highlight our learnings and unlearnings, and we explore the topics that have been rooted within us. I'm Amanda, and today on the podcast, I am joined by Martha Smart and Ghzala Khan, two of the inquiry's guides, who have been part of the group of individuals with lived experience guiding the inquiry. In this episode, we delve into social action, co-producing the inquiry, and relational work. Now let's get into the conversation. Thank you very much, Ghzala and Martha, for joining me today on this podcast. And I just thought before we jump into the conversation that we could maybe do a quick check-in. I'm thinking that because we have kind of a crisp winter day, our check-in could be related to the weather. If you want to use this as a prompt or not, if you were to describe how you're feeling today, how you're landing today, if it was a weather forecast, what would it be and why?
Well, for me, I think I'm feeling quite at home because this is being taped in my office. So for me, it's definitely a feeling of sunshine because the sun's out today in Glasgow. And I've suffered a couple of days with toothache, and today I feel better. So it's definitely looking brighter for me.
Thanks, Ghzala.
One of my good friends texted me on the way over here and said happy equinox. So that's what's in my head just now. I'm feeling a sense of calm, which I haven't felt over the past couple of days. So I'm hoping that that's like a sense of calm with the changing of the weather and the seasons. I'm hoping to channel the calmness of the change.
Thanks, Martha. Yeah, I feel a little bit like the calm after a storm. I was rushing around so much this morning. I think I was very relaxed when I woke up in like loads of time. And then I looked at the time and was like, oh no! Shoving all the mics and stuff in the bag and eating a quick bit of lunch. But I feel like now I'm here, I'm definitely more settled and the clouds have cleared away.
Nice, that is the story of my life. Rushing about late, that's the story of my life.
And this is normally my snooze time, so if you hear me starting to snore halfway through, it's because Ghzala needs a nap.
Come on now, this is going to be much more exciting than that.
We'll make sure we get you ready for your nap, Ghzala. I just wanted to start with the fact that this episode is part of the mini-series based on one of our values, which is being relational. I was just wondering if you have your own interpretation of what that means to be relational.
For me, it's a new concept. It's probably a term like choice points and other words and phrases that we've learnt since we've become guides. When I think of the word relational, I think of connections, I think of relationships, I think of building partnerships, understanding each other, taking into consideration each other's feelings. And that's something that we've very much attempted to do in the last 2 years. So the concept of relation will be something that I think we've looked at from the onset, and it has ridden right through and been quite obvious.
It's been at the forefront of my thinking or way of being for some time through my studies. What it means to be relational and how really everything we do is in relation. When it comes to the inquiry, it feels like it stands for a different way of working, perhaps tries to be less transactional and more relationship based.
I just wanted to move on to ask you both, because this episode's about social action, how did you both become involved in social action? Where was the place that you started? Where was the feeling that you started?
There was definitely a defining moment for me in 2019 when I was sitting at home watching the news and I was watching the Amazon on fire. It was literally like a switch. I actually can't just sit here anymore. I have to do something, try and do something about this. So that's probably the moment at which I would have started to classify myself as an activist. And then I started getting really involved in climate action in Dundee, and things just spiralled from there. And it was like I was ready to die on the hill of climate action. Prior to that, though, I'd always been passionately involved in different things. I'd probably fancied myself as quite a humanitarian. I worked with the Red Cross, with young homeless people. I wanted to try and make the world a better place, and tried to do that in lots of different avenues. I was also really involved in arts and culture and exploring ideas and issues about the world through drama and performance.
Brilliant. I've got to try and match that now. I think for me, social action isn't a term that we've used in our family or even within our communities. My faith, first and foremost, talks about charity and helping each other, whether it's your neighbours, whether it's members of the extended family. It's one of our beliefs that you can do as much as you can to make it easier for other people. However, my first, I think, probably attempt at some sort of social action would have been when I was around 24, 25, and I joined the local community radio station. That had not long been set up as the first Asian radio station in Glasgow, or Scotland even. At that time for me, it was just a lot of fun going in on a Monday night and playing Bollywood music and doing what I loved. Now that when I think back, the help and support that would have given people that were maybe isolated from families or living here alone, and hearing that friendly voice with the music and things like that, I appreciate now how much that would have meant to people. And similarly, my family, especially my mum and dad, who I'm really grateful for, they've done social action all their life. So our family have got our own charity. We're providing free education for young girls and boys in Pakistan. And mum and dad to this day, they fundraise and do lots of activities to try and get this school up and running, which it is now 10 years later. And I see that and I admire it. So for me, the word social action wasn't there. It was just a habit of us doing things for other people.
I would just like to add, Ghzala, when you first told me about your radio days, I just thought it was the coolest thing ever, and I really hope that everyone listening to this is going to get an opportunity to hear your radio voice intro, because I feel like they'd be really missing out if they didn't hear that.
I'll maybe do that.
Thanks, Ghzala. Thanks, Martha. I love the contrast there, but equally in their own right. Martha, there was something that was, like you say, that switch that just changed that mindset of I need to do something. With Ghzala yourself, it feels like something that you've been very integrated into your way of life, and something that comes really naturally to be someone who's looking out for other people and doing stuff. And I think that's something that we've grappled with a little bit within the inquiry, is social action itself. And one of our other guides, Innocent, brought the question of who defines what social action is. And we're really seeing that through some of the stories that are coming out of even your own voice, your own agency, saying, no, I don't want to do this anymore, I won't be treated like this, is a form of social action. And I was just wondering whether the two of you have any thoughts on building this definition that we're creating of social action. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
I think that's something that we have grappled with from the start of this process of defining the parameters of social action and what that means, and how that as a phrase kind of sits with us all as individuals and as a collective. It's certainly something that hasn't really sat with me. I've always kind of grappled with it a little bit, and I think part of the reason for that was having read the Together We Help research, which was done kind of off the back of this. Is that correct?
Yes, I know what you're referencing to, Martha. Yes, Together We Help was a kind of pre-Social Action Inquiry Scotland. Pandemic had hit and this inquiry was delayed, but because so much social action was happening during the pandemic, a portion of the funding was put towards community research in that scenario.
That's it. And one of their findings was, if I'm remembering correctly, that term social action, people didn't feel as though it resonated with them. And I think that we certainly found that in the inquiry as well. What are the parameters of social action? How do you define social action? And for me, as soon as you start to define it, you start to kind of water it down. So maybe the definition isn't actually that important. One of the things in studying kind of feminist literature about how the personal is political, and you know, you're speaking, Ghzala, about like your family, and which is very, very personal. You know, I think it can be the smallest act you could define as social action.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And I think it's become really apparent in the 2 years that we've been guides and interacting with everyone about everyone's perception of what social action is. You've got some people that are just speaking for one person and fighting for that one person. And then you've got individuals that are fighting for a whole community. The term social action, there's no actual defining it. And like you said, it was a word that never resonated with me growing up. And even in my work just now, working for a charity supporting minority ethnic communities, we're doing social action every day, but we don't see it as that because we're just getting funded for it and we're delivering a service. But without this service, there'd be a huge need for action to happen within the community. So it can be defined in a number of ways. And I think even after our 2 years doing this inquiry, we haven't actually got a full definition. But I'm pleased about that, because there shouldn't be a definition of what an individual portrays themselves as. Shopping for a neighbour because they've just come back from hospital or something like that and they can't make it out on their own. It's the smallest act, and then the huge acts around political activism. So it's very broad a term.
Thank you both for filling in those who are listening, and also just the space ourselves of thinking a little bit more about that definition of social action and that invitation to say, you know what, I reject having to fill in all of those gaps. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I think there is something in that, Amanda, about not filling in gaps and letting gaps exist. And I think that's something that we've done throughout this inquiry, and it's been a challenge, is actually we can't do everything, we can't define everything, and in doing so, we're actually doing a disservice.
So I just wanted to move on to the aspect of being a guide, and just to give our listeners a bit of an idea of what we mean when we say a guide in the inquiry. First of all, when the inquiry was set up, there was an idea that there would be an independent panel who would advise the core team in the inquiry. And it was always decided that this independent panel would be individuals with lived experience. But when the co-chairs, Sam and CR, came to look at the founding document and they made some changes, and these changes we talk about in one of our other episodes, but the main one is that we wanted to be interdependent, so that everybody involved had a mutual dependence on each other. Everybody was in, nobody was stepping out. And therefore it called for a difference in this independent panel. You know, it couldn't be a panel that the inquiry was servicing, for example. People had to be in, co-producing with us. And therefore the term of guide came about. And we've all agreed it's not the perfect term, but we're using it. And I think everybody involved at least understands when we say the term guide that there's someone who's guiding this journey of the inquiry. And I just wanted to ask the two of you, how did you become involved in being a guide? And maybe if you want to expand on what your experience has been like as a guide so far.
For me, I think it was maybe about 2.5 years ago. Sam got in touch. I think she'd heard about me through a third party and actually asked if I wanted to be part of a recruitment panel for the co-leads. So that would be Debbie and Daryl. At the time, I never knew Sam, never knew CR, and never knew Martha or anything about the inquiry at all. So I had a quick look at the notes and said, yep, happy to be at the panel, because I had some experience of doing interviews through my previous work. And then on screen pops up Martha, CR and Sam. I don't know about you, Martha, but there was an instant connection between all four of us. And it was like 2 days of interviewing. And I just remember it was all on Zoom at the time because we were all working from home. But that connection was so strong that when we actually became guides and we met in Edinburgh for the first time in February, and we hadn't seen each other since the interviews, and it was like 6 months later, I just remember, Martha, you running up to me and giving me the biggest hug, because this friendship that was there. That's the only word that I can describe. And it was just so nice to see you in person. We've hit it off ever since. After the interviews, I didn't know what was happening. I just know that Debbie and Daryl had taken on the role. And then Sam got in touch with me again and said, we're doing interviews for guides. And at the time, there was a bit of a workload. And I said, I'm not sure if I can take that extra time. And she said, we'll have a think about it. And I did. And I think it was the connections with Martha and CR and Sam. And I thought, I want to know more. So I did apply for it. And that's how I became a guide.
Yeah, I think we've just hit it off from the start, haven't we? A friendship for life, for sure. So how did I get involved? I had a connection with Daryl. He is from Dundee and we'd done quite a lot of work together over lockdown on the People's Assembly process. So we had worked together through that. So that was the kind of connection. Sam had reached out to me and asked if I would help do the recruitment for the co-leads. And I was like, yeah, that would be great. I've never done any recruitment before. So you were very much looking after me, Ghzala. You took me under your wing, Mrs. Professional, done it before, no problem. I was probably a bit of a nervous wreck, to be honest, but I think you're right. From that initial online meeting, we just hit it off, and then I decided I'd love to continue to be part of the process and done the application to become a guide, and it all took off from there, really, to here we are 2 years later.
I was just wondering if there was anything that you felt helped you in your journey as a guide or hindered you in your journey as a guide.
I feel I've grown as a person in the last 2 years in the sense that I've seen how much talent there is out there with the guides and the whole group. And I've learnt so much about social action and everyone's values and their dedication and their commitment to making sure that change comes. I guess the challenges for me, and I'm getting better at it, is that I've come from an environment where everything's set in stone. Where I work as an organisation that gets funding, and before you apply for that funding, you've got your outcomes, your outputs and your activities and when you're going to do it by. And for me, the challenging part was at the free flow thinking and having to co-produce and bring everybody in. And it was hard for me. I wanted to maybe say, take the lead, no, do it this way because this way works. But having to sit back and listen to people and make that relational decision, which is why I hadn't known the term before now, but that was initially a challenge for me. But I've grown used to it now. The more we've met, I've understood that this is a co-production, that we are making the decisions together, and whatever way the inquiry leads us, we're guiding it. There's no end point to this inquiry. It's wherever it took us, and that's something I had to get used to.
It's a difficult question because it's been 2 years. The amount that you change as a person and the amount of things that happen in your life in the space of 2 years is just insane. So to try and reflect on the whole process and how much my life has changed and how much I have changed, that has been one of the struggles for me of this process, is that it's been a long journey and it's been hard to see where the other side is and where do we end in some sort of a way. Personally in my life, when I joined the inquiry, I was really involved in loads of different things, loads of climate activism stuff. And my life changed quite significantly. I had a poor mental health at one point, and I almost completely stopped actually being involved in activism. So I was coming from it from quite a different position and a different place, and the support of all of the guides and the inquiry has just been phenomenal. And to be able to get to know people on such a personal, intimate level and all the work that people do has been transformational for me. I've always struggled with this process as well as the change that we want to see in the world and how big that change always was from the get-go, and how, we were all so aware at the beginning of this process of the huge systemic issues that we're talking about and trying to deal with. A lot of the time they just feel so far away that you feel like you're not going to manage to make any inroads whatsoever into them. Being able to be within the system and trying to change it at the same time, trying to do things differently, but being aware of how we're actually still repeating in some ways these systemic inequalities. That has been difficult, and I think trying to balance making change happen and making action happen whilst also reflecting on it has been quite difficult for me as well, and how to manage the kind of tensions between those two things. I think that dynamic you were speaking about, Ghzala, about the traditional way of doing things which works, and how we were quite different in terms of that, because you were coming very much from a professional background and you're very, very good at what you do and you make things happen. I was coming very much more from a grassroots, volunteering my time basically. So we both did come from very different places, which probably helped and hindered us in parallel ways.
I agree, absolutely agree, Martha. And I think it wasn't just the two of us. I think it was everybody in that room and their own lived experiences and what they brought to the table were both help and at times hinder. There was people that were quite strong and very focused on how the journey should take place, and I was probably one of them. And then there was people that were quite happy to go with the flow. But again, I think it all went down to the level of experience that was down the room. We weren't all from the same backgrounds. We weren't all from the same communities. Even our cultural backgrounds were different. Our abilities were different. Our skill sets were different. So it wasn't a norm where, you put people in a room together and everybody's from the same background and things start to flow. And I remember saying to you, Martha, I think at one point during a break that we're in the norming, forming, performing and storming. I can't remember if that's the order, but that's the kind of stage we're at. And I think at that weekend we were probably storming and we were both quite frustrated with that we just weren't getting the answers that we were looking for. But needless to say, we started performing. It's just weird thinking back to that time, and absolutely agree with you. That it was the different elements of who brought what to the table that was sometimes a hinder.
I think one of the things I felt as well, Ghzala, I don't know how you feel, but I felt like quite a strong weight and sense of responsibility and an honour to be part of this process and wanting to honour this process and making sure that our outcomes were concrete. Something that Darryl had said to me a while ago when we worked together on the People's Assembly was I had a kind of frustration about the outcome of that process wasn't quite as I had wanted it to be. And he reminded me of how much it was actually about the process rather than the outcomes of the process. So that's something that I think I try and hold quite close.
Thanks, Martha. I just wanted to add was that at times when we were meeting up every 2 months or so, I think it was, and you would go away at the end of the 2 days online or in person and you'd think, what have we really achieved here over this weekend? But now reflecting back in the 2 years, we've managed to actually pass money on for social action. And then over the last 3-4 months, we've gathered all these stories that are about social action and what helps and what hinders. And these will hopefully go on display for the rest of the world to see. It's amazing that what we've actually produced from just sort of sitting and chatting for 2 days every couple of months, that's what's phenomenal to me.
So as we're moving to the end of the conversation, just wondering whether either of you had some offerings or learnings that you could give to our audience when it comes to the role of a guide or co-production or being involved within an inquiry.
One of my learnings is go with the flow and not be as pressured into getting outcomes and outputs, and to see how things emerge on their own. And I guess emergence is one of the big words that we use in this inquiry. Any advice for anyone that's doing something similar would be to ride it out, because you will get there in the end, and it might feel a bit muddy in between, but it will become clearer at some point.
Yeah, and I suppose maybe just to build on that, a phrase that I've really carried with me for a while now that keeps kind of being reaffirmed. A writer, Donna Haraway, wrote about staying with the trouble, and I see that as staying on the journey. Maybe it's going with the flow, maybe it's not being obsessed about outcomes, maybe it's also a way of kind of sitting with the horror, which sounds really dramatic, but think when you start to really tap into what people are facing in society today, horror wouldn't be too far-fetched a word necessarily to use. So something about sitting with that and journeying with that has been huge for me, and being able to trust each other in that process. Something that I learned in parallel with this inquiry in my life was, I think at one point in my life I had an idea that there would be some like shiny rainbow land at the other side of all of this, not just the inquiry, but at the other side of these kind of broken systems that we're living under and trying to fight against. And I think something I've come to learn and realise is that systems don't really break, they change, and sometimes you have to try and splinter systems, and slowly it takes time to break down systems and to splinter systems. I think that's been huge for me.
I would just like to now move to our checkout question. Now that we've finished this conversation about journeys and social action and that sense of change, wondering if you could say how you're feeling now if it was a mode of transport.
The first thing that came to my head was a pogo stick. That's how I feel. I feel a bit like a pogo stick. You know, I think when I speak about these things, especially when we speak together, Ghzala, you know, I feel this force just move through me, and it kind of shakes my body and feels a little bit like it's like a force that is like acting through me. And I think in terms of social action, I've always felt like that. It's never really felt too much like a choice. It's always been like a very emotive thing. So I feel quite emotional. So I feel a bit like a pogo stick jumping up and down.
I love that, pogo stick. That's really funny that you say that, Martha, because the first vehicle that came into my head was Knight Rider's kit. Martha's asking, what's that? Michael Knight from Knight Rider had a talking car, and they solved crimes together. So Kit would talk, and there was this amazing bond and relationship, and they would help each other through situations. And I feel that that's the car at the end of this journey, and the challenges and the adventures that we've had, and we've talked to each other right through them.
Absolutely. And there's something about that vulnerability with each other, and being able to be vulnerable with each other and cry with each other and hold each other in all of the spaces that we've been in.
You're both so profound. I need to think of one. In my head, I was thinking like roller skates, where you're maybe a bit sketchy at first, but then you kind of get used to them and you start being able to meander in and out of things. But you need your knee pads, because there's times where you just crash and then you have to get yourself back up again. I feel like that has been for me like this experience, loving the flow, but also you're gonna fall over at some point.
Love that. So you're going to close us out, Ghzala? You did promise us that you would.
You've been tuned into Amanda, Martha and Ghzala, and this is the podcast called Relational. Thank you very much for listening, and I wish you a very good afternoon.
Thank you for joining us on this episode about social action and relational work. I have 2 questions that you can ponder in your own self-reflective time. These are, what does social action look like and feel like to you? And how can you incorporate relational ways of working into your spaces? Thank you again for joining us on the Wavicle podcast, and we can't wait for you to join us on the next one.